Welcome to Sox Degrees. Our guest this week is a groovy friend, Dan Epstein, an author and award-winning journalist who has written several baseball books about the 1970s. And he is, not just in my opinion, but the opinion of most who know these things, the most knowledgeable person on the planet about not only 1970s big league baseball and its cultural significance, but maybe more about rock and roll than anyone I know. And he has a new book out. It's a collaboration with Ron Bloomberg called The Captain and Me On and Off the Field with Thurman Munson. We will get into that a little later. Dan, welcome to Sox Degrees, and let's dive in. No small talk here on the podcast.
Let's do it.
What is your earliest baseball memory?
My earliest baseball memory, I think it would be the 1969 World Series, because I would have been 3. My dad was a huge Mets fan. We moved to Ann Arbor, Michigan about a year earlier, but he was terribly homesick the entire time we lived there. So any sort of New York connection, he could keep going. So obviously when the Mets were in the series in 69, it was a big deal to him. And my visual with that is I remember seeing a shot of I guess it must have been like a hot double down the left field line and somebody in the stands reaching over to grab the ball, and that was a problem. And I remember my dad yelling at the TV about it and explaining to me that you should not reach, if you're at a ball game, you do not reach over the rail and grab the ball. So I've actually I keep meaning to go back to the 69 World Series and try to find that moment, that initial baseball moment for me, but I haven't done so yet.
Well, it's in a good segue because on a recent edition of this podcast, Jason said that he stopped watching Andy Griffith when it went from black and white to color, that was a demarcation, that essentially that show was over. Not that there were awful episodes after, but that it just didn't have its significance.
Right.
Whereas you as a baseball fan, and tell me if I'm wrong, it feels like it's the opposite, that when baseball went from black and white to vibrant color in the early 1970s, that's what really grabbed you. Is that an accurate statement?
Well, no, but that's only because we didn't have a color TV till 1975. So, but I do think that the importance of color TV with baseball and its connection to baseball in the 70s is something that's often really overlooked. Basically, that's why all these teams started adopting really colorful uniforms in the 1970s, was because the 70s was the first time that more Americans had color TVs than black and white. So it was really a kind of a genius marketing thing in a sport that was not really good at marketing at that point. Charlie Finley, of course, started it with the Kansas City A's, the kind of really vibrant green, gold, and white. He was the first person to really kind of cotton to the idea that people would want to watch the team, even if they were terrible, if they looked cool. So, and that really, by the early 70s, that really caught on. That also had, the exchange of the wool flannels for the polyester double knits had a lot to do with that too, because you could make polyester double knits a lot more colorful than you could make wool flannels.
Is there any better Sports Illustrated cover than Dick Allen juggling and smoking?
It's certainly in my top 3, I think. That's probably it. I can't think of a better one. Plus, he's wearing that sweet early 70s White Sox, with the red pinstripes. And I love that. That's probably my favorite White Sox uniform, that, both the home with the red pinstripes and the away with the powder blues set against the really vibrant red. I think that's just such a great look. book. I wish they'd go back to it.
What about baseball in the 70s brings the smile that we just saw on the stream here to your face and doesn't allow it to leave?
Oh man, I mean, how much time you got? I think, for me, I guess it mostly comes back to that 70s baseball is when the 70s is when baseball and pop culture really collide in a way that they hadn't done so before, and in a lot of ways never did again. It's like there's just this huge spillover between what was going on in in sort of the whether it's the hippie movement, the Black Power movement, the disco movement. There's so much overlap into the sport, and you just have to go back to the 60s, and it was like baseball was in this sort of bubble. Like whatever was happening in the rest of America, it wasn't impacting baseball at all. But in the 70s, you have all these players. I think a lot of it is because you have a lot of these players had been in college in the 60s and had, intentionally or not, absorbed a lot of the kind of change in attitudes that was happening on American college campus, and then brought it to the ballpark in the 1970s. And I think it just made for a much more fun, interesting, unusual decade in the game. And then at the same time, so much that happened in the 70s in baseball continues to impact the game today. And when I started out to write Big Hair and Plastic Grass, my first 70s baseball book, it was really with the intention of shining the spotlight on that and on a decade that I really felt was very underappreciated, both for its impact on the game and for the incredible characters who played the game in that period.
I also think the 70s in general were kind of the Wild West in sports. You had the World Hockey Association, the ABA,
World Football League.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it was like no experiment was off limits on the sports landscape. But you're right about baseball, and you mentioned television, and I think it was a really important decade for baseball on television because you think about Hank Aaron's home run, you think about Carlton Fisk's home run. There are these iconic moments, Reggie Jackson, Mr. October. Those things still to this day, Dan, resonate. And we're almost 50 years later now. It's really incredible.
Yeah, I mean, the Hank Aaron 715th home run, that's really like if you're talking my own baseball memories, that's the first one I have where I really understood what was going on. I understood what was at stake. We had a conversation in my second grade classroom the day before, like, Hank Aaron is going to break Babe Ruth's record, and what that means, and what that means that a black player is doing this. And, it was so, I remember, usually, I think it was a Monday night. So usually I would be watching The Rookies, which was a popular cop show at the time, and would get annoyed if my dad changed it to something else. But the idea that we were going to watch Hank Aaron play this baseball game against the Dodgers, and that there was a good chance that he would break the record while we were watching. I mean, that was like, I knew I was about to see history made, and that was incredibly exciting for me. And it's, I still get chills thinking about it to this day.
And before we get out of that decade maybe and wander around here, and we talked on an earlier podcast about a year ago about the teams that were dominant in that era. And in baseball now, you think a lot about the big teams, the Yankees, the Dodgers, the Red Sox, all those teams. And while mid to late 1970s, those teams started to get to the playoffs in the World Series, you had the Orioles and the Pirates and the aforementioned A's and the Big Red Machine, the Reds. It was a different decade, that era, where you didn't have the big guys and then everybody else. It really got spread around, the wealth, so to speak, in the 70s, right?
Yeah, even the teams that didn't quite make it, like the Kansas City Royals. In the second half of the 70s, the Royals teams were incredibly exciting to watch, and came very close to going to the World Series. Same with the Phillies. I mean, it's interesting to me that 1980, both the Royals and the Phillies finally make it to the World Series together after being, repeatedly shut down, just a game or two away from it. And then, of course, you have the 72 White Sox and the 77 Southside Hitmen, which, teams that were kind of in contention and, for a while looked like they might take the division, and they didn't, but they were so much fun to watch that they really, left their mark on anybody who was around for those seasons.
What is it, by the way, just as an aside, about the teams that didn't quite make it that still resonate with fan bases, right? It's you and I have our Michigan connection. There are some Tiger teams that didn't quite make it that still are near and dear to Tiger fans' hearts. You mentioned the 77 Sox, the 69 Cubs. There is something about baseball that teams that didn't quite get there still hold a very special place in fans' hearts.
Yeah, I think that there is that, that sense of you took the ride with the team and it didn't quite pan out, but you were completely invested, and, there were those moments where you thought yes, this is it. This is finally, I wasn't paying attention in 69, but anybody I talked to who followed the Cubs back then, it was like they just gave their hearts to that team, and same with the 77 Southside Hitmen. It's going into August, they were in first place, and it looked like, and even then, and I do remember the 77 Sox team, and even then it was this is a really flawed team, really didn't have much pitching, terrible on defense, not much speed, but they could hit the bejesus out of the ball. And, and you had guys like Richie Zisk and Oscar Gamble who just, were showing up for that one season. And every game seemed like a party. Every game at Comiskey seemed like a party. And so there was just, I think anybody being realistic that summer probably would have been yeah, the Royals are probably going to come back and take the division, which they did. But, if you were along for the ride, you will never forget it.
Yeah, I was reading this story on Fangraphs the other day about why we love bad players. Why we love bad baseball players. And they mentioned Don Kelly and Augie Ojeda and Munenori Kawasaki. I'm interested, as I was reading this and I knew we were going to talk to you, who are your favorite bad players?
Oh, man, that's a great question. I don't think anyone has ever asked me that. Oh, wow. I'll tell you my least favorite bad player in 1976. That was the only year that I rooted for the Yankees, because I thought it was kind of cool that I love Thurman Munson, and we'll get to that. But I thought it was really cool that the Yankees were kind of in the World Series after being away for so long, 12 whole years. But when you're 10 years old, 12 years seems like a long time. So, but I remember Fred Chicken Stanley, who was the Yankees shortstop, who was awful, and I remember just resenting it, because they were playing the Reds, and the Reds had Davey Concepcion, who was fantastic, and I remember just thinking, why do they have to have this guy? Who is putting a gun to Billy Martin's head and running him out in the lineup? But then I find out many years later that Billy Martin loved Fred Stanley because he reminded him of himself, so he was very resentful when George Steinbrenner got Bucky Dent and forced Billy to put Bucky Dent in the lineup instead of Fred Stanley. In terms of favorites, though, I would have to say, I'm thinking back on those, in the 70s as a kid, I was really into the Tigers, really into the Dodgers because I was spending the summers out in LA with my mom. He wasn't bad, but I really liked Lee Lacy on the Dodgers. He was this guy who was like, on another team, he could have been a starter, but the Dodgers were just so loaded in the outfield, or so unwilling to take Rick Monday out of the lineup, even if they should have, that Lee Lacy could never really get any traction on the team. So I always kind of rooted for him because I thought he deserved better.
I love that the emotions of childhood do not ever go away. Like, you're like, even if they should have, and there's a tinge of hate that still lingers. And God, I love that about baseball.
Well, here's an example. Like several years back, a friend of mine, when I was still living in LA, a friend of mine visited me there. A guy who'd been my best friend in like 5th and 6th grade, back in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And I hadn't seen him in years. And he came over to my house and we had lunch. It was great. And we started going through my baseball programs, stuff that I was looking at when I was writing Stars and Strikes. I had a big pile of stuff from 1976 because that's what the book is about. And I handed him the Tigers yearbook from 76, the one that they published at the beginning of the season that, you could buy at Tiger Stadium. And I handed it to him. And the first thing that he said was not wow, was not, oh, cool. The first thing he said was, Tigers suck, which was the exact thing we always used to say back in 1976, because the Tigers did suck, with the exception of, Mark Fidrich, who kind of came out of nowhere that season. And, Ron LaFleur had a great year and Rusty Staub. But that's what we would say to each other in school. It was kind of like, almost like this bonding thing. Like, yeah, Tigers suck. Like, we're too cool to root for these guys, even though we love them because we know they suck. And yeah, right out of the well of childhood.
Oh, that is so great. That is so great.